The breaking point: David Martinez had always prided himself on being a patient father. At 34 years old, he had weathered 2 years of sleepless nights, countless diaper changes, and the general chaos that came with raising his daughter Emma. But today, standing outside the city's largest shopping mall with his screaming toddler in a broken stroller, his legendary patience was finally reaching its limit. The morning had started well enough. David had planned a simple outing to buy Emma some new clothes and perhaps grab lunch at the food court. It was supposed to be their special father-daughter time while his wife Sarah worked her weekend shift at the hospital. Emma had been excited, chattering happily in her car seat about seeing the big stores and maybe getting a pretzel. But everything started going wrong the moment they arrived at the mall. The parking garage was completely full, forcing David to circle for 20 minutes before finding a spot on the roof level. Emma had grown increasingly fussy during the search, and by the time he parked, she was already showing signs of an impending meltdown then. As David was lifting Emma out of her car seat, the stroller he had been relying on for the entire trip suddenly collapsed. One of the support mechanisms had apparently been weakening for weeks, and the stress of being opened and closed repeatedly finally caused a critical joint to snap. The stroller folded in on itself with a sharp crack, leaving David holding his daughter while staring at what was now essentially an expensive pile of bent metal and torn fabric. "It's okay, sweetie," David said to Emma, though he could feel his own stress levels rising. "We'll figure something out." But Emma was 2 years old. At 2 years old, figuring something out wasn't a concept that made much sense. She wanted her stroller, she wanted to be moving, and she wanted things to be the way they were supposed to be. When none of those things happened quickly enough for her satisfaction, she began to cry. David tried carrying her while dragging the broken stroller, hoping to find somewhere inside the mall where he could either fix it or buy a replacement. But Emma was going through a phase where being carried for extended periods made her claustrophobic and cranky. Within minutes, her crying had escalated to full-scale screaming, the kind that made other parents give him sympathetic but relieved looks that said, "Better you than me." The mall's main entrance was crowded with weekend shoppers, and David found himself trying to navigate through groups of teenagers, elderly couples walking slowly, and families with their own strollers and shopping bags. Every few steps, someone would bump into his broken stroller or give him annoyed looks as Emma's screams echoed through the entrance area. "Sir, you can't bring that broken equipment in here," a security guard said, appearing beside David with the kind of officious tone that immediately set his teeth on edge. "It's a safety hazard." David stopped walking and turned to face the guard, a middle-aged man whose uniform looked too tight and whose expression suggested he enjoyed exercising what little authority his position provided. The name tag read Gerald, and Gerald was clearly having a good day telling people what they couldn't do. "It just broke," David explained, trying to keep his voice calm despite Emma's continued screaming. "I'm trying to find somewhere to either fix it or replace it." "We just got here. Doesn't matter," Gerald said, crossing his arms. "Broken equipment can't come inside? Mall policy. You'll have to take it back to your car." David felt something hot and angry rising in his chest. Take it back to his car? The car that was parked 20 minutes away on the roof of the garage, while carrying a screaming 2-year-old and dragging a broken stroller? "Look," David said, trying to maintain some semblance of reasonableness. "I understand you have policies, but this is kind of an emergency situation. My daughter needs her stroller, and I need to buy a replacement. Can't I just leave this by customer service or something while I shop?" "No, sir," Gerald said, clearly enjoying the power dynamic. "Broken equipment cannot enter the mall under any circumstances. It's a liability issue. You'll have to remove it from the premises." Emma's screaming was getting louder, and David could feel the stares of other shoppers. Some looked sympathetic, but others seemed annoyed that his family drama was disrupting their peaceful shopping experience. A group of teenagers walked by, one of them making a comment about controlling your kid that David pretended not to hear. "This is ridiculous," David said, his voice getting tighter. "I'm not trying to cause problems. I just need to buy a new stroller so my daughter can be comfortable. 5 minutes in your store? That's all I need, sir." I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice, Gerald said, his hand moving to his radio. And I'm going to need you to remove that broken equipment immediately. The radio gesture pushed David over an edge he hadn't realized he was approaching. Here he was, struggling with a broken stroller and a screaming child, trying to be a responsible parent and solve his problems appropriately. And this mall security guard was treating him like some kind of troublemaker who needed to be controlled and managed. "You've got to be kidding me," David said, his voice rising, despite Gerald's warning. "I'm trying to buy something. I'm trying to spend money in your mall. And you're going to kick me out because a piece of equipment broke?" "Sir, I'm warning you about your tone," Gerald said, unclipping his radio. "I can call for backup if necessary." Backup. The security guard was threatening to call backup because a father with a broken stroller was asking for basic human consideration. David looked around at the other shoppers, some of whom were now openly staring at the confrontation. Emma was still screaming. The broken stroller was tangled around his legs. And this petty dictator in a security uniform was making everything exponentially worse. "This is insane," David said, his voice getting louder. "You're treating me like a criminal because my stroller broke. I have a screaming child, I need to buy a replacement, and you're telling me I have to walk 20 minutes back to my car, and then 20 minutes back here? Sir, if you don't lower your voice and remove the broken equipment, I'm going to have to call for assistance," Gerald said. His finger hovering over his radio button, David felt 2 years of accumulated parenting stress, exhaustion, and frustration crystallizing into a moment of pure anger. Here was everything wrong with the world, condensed into one interaction: bureaucratic inflexibility, petty authority, and complete lack of basic human empathy. He was trying to be a good father, trying to solve problems responsibly, and he was being treated like a threat to public safety. Emma's screaming reached a new pitch. Other shoppers were starting to form a loose circle around the confrontation, and Gerald's finger was still hovering over that radio button. It's like he was preparing to call in the National Guard. Something inside, David snapped. The explosion the moment David felt his control slip away was like watching himself from outside his own body. All the accumulated stress from months of sleep deprivation, financial pressure from Emma's childcare costs, and the constant challenge of balancing work and fatherhood seemed to converge into a single point of explosive frustration. "You know what?" David heard himself saying, his voice rising to match Emma's screams.
Ow.
"This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever encountered. I'm a paying customer trying to solve a problem, and you're treating me like I'm some kind of security threat." Gerald's response was to press the button on his radio. "Control, this is Gerald at the main entrance. I need backup for a disruptive individual." That radio call was the final straw. David had been trying to handle an embarrassing situation with as much dignity as possible. But now this mall cop was officially escalating things, calling him disruptive like he was some kind of troublemaker, rather than a frustrated father dealing with broken equipment and a screaming child. "Disruptive," David shouted, his voice echoing through the mall entrance. "I'm disruptive. You're the one making this impossible." The crowd of shoppers around them was growing larger, some people actively stopping to watch the confrontation unfold. David could see phones being pulled out, and he realized with horror that he was probably being recorded by multiple people who would later post videos of his meltdown on social media. But in that moment, the awareness of being watched only made his anger burn hotter. These people were treating his family crisis like entertainment, standing around gawking while he struggled with a situation that was spiraling completely out of control. Emma, apparently sensing her father's escalating distress, began crying even harder. Her little face was red and streaked with tears, and she kept reaching toward the broken stroller as if she couldn't understand why her familiar, comfortable seat wasn't available to her. "Sir, I'm going to need you to calm down and move away from the entrance," Gerald said, taking a step forward with the kind of authority that suggested backup was already on the way. "Calm down," David repeated, his voice getting louder. "My daughter is screaming, my stroller is broken, I'm trying to buy a replacement, and you're treating me like a criminal. How exactly am I supposed to calm down?" "Sir, your behavior is disturbing other customers," Gerald replied, gesturing toward the growing crowd. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. Leave the premises." After driving 20 minutes to get here, spending 20 minutes finding parking, and dealing with all this chaos, David was being kicked out before he could even attempt to solve his problem. The injustice of it felt overwhelming. "This is unbelievable," David said, his voice cracking with frustration. Absolutely unbelievable. He looked down at Emma, who was now crying so hard she could barely catch her breath, then at the broken stroller that had started this entire mess. Then at Gerald, who was standing there with his arms crossed like some kind of mall dictator. And finally at the crowd of people who were watching his family fall apart like it was some kind of reality TV show. The anger that had been building inside him all morning, all week, maybe all year, suddenly had a focus. It wasn't really about Gerald, or even about the mall's stupid policy. It was about every moment of feeling powerless as a parent. Every time he'd had to smile and be polite while dealing with unreasonable people. Every instance where he'd swallowed his frustration and tried to be the better person while others made his life harder than it needed to be. The broken stroller was still in his free hand. Its twisted metal frame and torn fabric, a perfect symbol of everything that had gone wrong. David looked at it, looked at Gerald's smug expression, looked at the crowd of gawking strangers, and felt something inside him snap completely. "You want me to remove the broken equipment?" David shouted, lifting the collapsed stroller over his head. "Fine, I'll remove the broken equipment." Time seemed to slow down as David drew back his arm and hurled the broken stroller directly at Gerald. The twisted metal frame sailed through the air, trailing pieces of torn fabric and broken plastic. While the crowd around them gasped and stepped back, Gerald's eyes went wide with shock and fear as he realized what was happening. He tried to duck, but the stroller was too big and he was too slow. The frame caught him squarely in the chest, knocking him backward into a decorative planter that stood near the entrance. The impact sent Gerald tumbling over the planter's edge, and David heard the distinctive sound of someone landing hard in dirt and decorative plants. The crowd erupted in surprised shouts and exclamations, and several people screamed as if they had just witnessed a violent crime. For a moment, everything was silent except for Emma's continued crying and the sound of Gerald groaning from somewhere inside the planter. David stood there, still holding his daughter, staring at what he had just done with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. Then the shouting started. "Oh my God, did you see that? Someone call security? Call the police. Is that guy okay?" David looked around at the crowd, all of whom were now staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to fear to outright disgust. The phones that had been out to record his argument were now definitely recording his assault on a security guard. And David realized that his moment of explosive anger had just created consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. Gerald was struggling to get out of the planter, dirt and mulch covering his uniform, his radio crackling with increasingly urgent calls for backup. His face was red with embarrassment and anger. And when he finally managed to climb out and face David, his expression promised serious retaliation. "You're under arrest," Gerald shouted, brushing dirt off his uniform. "That's assault. You assaulted a security officer." The reality of what David had done was beginning to sink in through the red haze of his anger. He had thrown a broken stroller at a security guard, in front of dozens of witnesses, while holding his 2-year-old daughter. All of it had been recorded on multiple phones and would probably be uploaded to the internet within hours. Emma was still crying, but now her tears seemed to be as much about sensing her father's distress as about the original stroller problem. She clung to David's shirt with her tiny fists, seeking comfort from the same person who had just created a situation that was infinitely worse than anything they had been dealing with before. David could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Gerald's backup was apparently going to include actual police officers, and David realized that his moment of anger had just transformed him from a frustrated customer into a legitimate criminal suspect. The crowd around them continued to grow, with people pointing and whispering and taking pictures. Some looked entertained by the drama, others looked concerned for Emma's welfare, and still others looked like they were trying to decide whether David might be dangerous enough to require a wider berth. As the sirens grew louder, David looked down at his daughter and realized that his explosive moment of frustration hadn't solved anything. Emma was still crying. The stroller was still broken. And now they were facing problems much bigger than mall policies and broken equipment. The worst part was seeing the fear in some people's eyes as they looked at him. He had become the kind of person that others needed to be protected from. The kind of parent who lost control in public and created dangerous situations for everyone around him, including his own child. The sirens were very close now, and David could see security guards running toward them from deeper inside the mall. His moment of anger had lasted maybe 10 seconds, but the consequences were going to last much longer than that. The aftermath, the police officers who arrived at the scene moved with professional efficiency that made David's stomach drop. There were 3 of them, all looking like they had dealt with similar situations countless times before. Their calm, authoritative presence immediately changed the atmosphere from chaotic spectacle to serious legal matter. "Sir, I need you to put the child down and step away from the security officer," the lead officer commanded, his hand resting casually on his equipment belt. David felt Emma's grip tighten on his shirt as she sensed the new tension in the air. She had finally stopped crying, but now she was clinging to him with the desperate strength that toddlers used when they sensed danger they couldn't understand. "I can't put her down," David said, his voice hoarse from shouting. "She's my daughter. I'm not going to abandon her." The officer's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Sir, no one is asking you to abandon your child, but I need to secure this situation, and that means I need you to cooperate with my instructions." Gerald had finally managed to fully extract himself from the planter and was brushing the last of the dirt from his uniform. His face was flushed with embarrassment and anger, and David could see scratches on his hands from where he had tried to break his fall among the decorative rocks and plants. "Officer, this man assaulted me," Gerald said, pointing an accusatory finger at David. "Threw that broken stroller right at me. Dozens of witnesses saw it happen. I want to press full charges." The lead officer looked at the twisted remains of the stroller, which were now scattered across the mall entrance like debris from a small explosion. Then he looked at David, still holding Emma, and finally at the crowd of onlookers, who were all nodding and murmuring agreement with Gerald's account. "Sir, I need you to tell me your version of what happened here," the officer said to David. David took a shaky breath, trying to organize his thoughts into something coherent. How could he explain the frustration, the accumulation of stress, the feeling of being treated unfairly that had led to his explosive moment? How could he make anyone understand that he wasn't normally the kind of person who threw things at security guards? "My stroller broke," David began, his voice sounding weak and inadequate even to himself. "I was just trying to buy a replacement, and he told me I couldn't bring it inside. I got frustrated, and I lost my temper." The officer nodded, making notes in a small pad. "And then you threw the stroller at the security officer?" "Yes," David admitted, the word feeling like a confession to a much larger crime than simple assault. "I threw the stroller." Emma stirred in his arms, and David realized she was probably hungry and definitely tired. This whole ordeal had taken place during what should have been her nap time, and the stress of the situation was wearing on her as much as it was on him. "Daddy," Emma said quietly, the first word she had spoken since the morning started going wrong. "Home." The simple question hit David like a physical blow. Yes, she wanted to go home. She wanted to be in her familiar environment, away from the chaos and stress that he had created. But going home wasn't going to be an option for quite some time, "Sir. I'm going to need to place you under arrest," the officer said, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda rights sounded surreal when applied to David's situation. He had heard them countless times on television shows and movies, but hearing them directed at him personally, in front of his daughter and dozens of strangers, felt like stepping into an alternate reality where he was the kind of person who got arrested at shopping malls. "What about my daughter?" David asked desperately. "I can't leave her alone. Is there someone you can call to pick her up?" the officer asked, David's mind raced through his options. Sarah was at work at the hospital and couldn't leave in the middle of her shift. His parents lived 3 hours away. Sarah's parents were out of town. His sister lived across the country. The realization that he had no immediately available support system made the situation feel even more desperate. "My wife is at work," David said. "She's a nurse. She can't just leave." The officer nodded sympathetically but continued with the arrest procedure. "We'll work something out. Child Services has people who can help in situations like this." Child Services. The words made David's blood run cold. His moment of anger had escalated. Beyond assault charges, now there was a possibility that Emma could be taken into protective custody because he had demonstrated that he couldn't control his temper in public. As the officer began to apply the handcuffs, David looked around at the crowd that was still watching with rapt attention. Some people looked satisfied, as if justice was being served. Others looked concerned, particularly some parents who seemed to be imagining themselves in similar situations. A few were still recording everything on their phones. "Please," David said to no one in particular. "Someone needs to call my wife." A woman stepped forward from the crowd. An older lady with kind eyes who had been watching the entire confrontation with obvious concern. "I'll call her," she said gently. "What's her number?" David rattled off Sarah's work number, praying that she would be able to answer and that there would be some way to resolve this situation without involving Child Services. The woman dialed the number on her phone and stepped aside to make the call while the officer finished with the handcuffs. Emma began to cry again as she realized that something was seriously wrong with her daddy. The handcuffs were frightening her, and the presence of so many uniformed officers made it clear this was a situation far beyond her understanding. "It's okay, sweetheart," David tried to tell her, but his voice broke as he spoke. How could he tell her it was okay when it clearly wasn't? How could he reassure her when he didn't know what was going to happen next? Gerald was speaking with one of the other officers, giving his official statement and pointing repeatedly at the scattered remains of the stroller. David could hear him describing the incident as an unprovoked attack, a violent outburst from an unstable individual who had endangered everyone present. The description wasn't entirely inaccurate, David realized with growing horror. From an outside perspective, that's exactly what had happened. A man with a screaming child had gotten into an argument with security and had responded by throwing a heavy object at the guard. The context and frustration that had led to the moment didn't change the basic facts of what had occurred. The kind woman who had called Sarah returned with news that made David's heart sink even further. "She's in surgery," the woman reported. "They said it's an emergency procedure and she can't be interrupted." They took a message. But it could be hours before she can respond. Hours. Emma would be alone with strangers for hours, while David sat in jail, and Sarah remained unaware of what had happened. The cascade of consequences from his 10 seconds of anger was growing more devastating by the minute. As the officers prepared to escort David to their patrol car, the lead officer pulled him aside for a moment. "Look," he said quietly, "I've got kids too, and I can see you're not a bad guy who just snapped. But you assaulted someone in front of dozens of witnesses, and there's no getting around that. The best thing you can do now is cooperate fully and hope the judge sees this as an isolated incident." David nodded. The officer was being as kind as possible under the circumstances. But the reality was clear. David's moment of explosive anger had transformed him from a frustrated parent into a criminal defendant, and there was no taking it back. As they walked toward the patrol car, David could hear the murmur of the crowd behind them and the sound of Emma crying for her daddy. The broken stroller remained scattered across the mall, entrance-like evidence of his complete failure as a father and as a human being capable of controlling his emotions under pressure. The worst part wasn't even the legal consequences he was facing. The worst part was the knowledge that Emma would remember this day, would remember seeing her father lose control and get taken away by police officers. The worst part was knowing that his inability to handle frustration appropriately had just given his daughter a traumatic memory that would probably last her entire life. The unexpected turn, David sat in the holding cell for 3 hours before anything significant happened. The bare walls and fluorescent lighting gave him plenty of time to replay his moment of explosive anger over and over, each mental review making him feel worse about what he had done and more worried about Emma's well-being. During those long hours, David's mind ran through every possible scenario. Would he lose his job when his employer found out about the arrest? Would Sarah ever be able to trust him alone with Emma again? Would the video footage that people had certainly taken end up on social media, making him a cautionary tale about parental meltdowns? When the duty officer finally came to get him, David was surprised to learn that someone wanted to see him. He had expected his first visitor to be a lawyer or possibly Sarah, once she got word of what had happened. Instead, he was told that Gerald, the security guard he had assaulted, was asking to speak with him. "He wants to talk to me?" David asked, confused. "Why would he want to see me?" "Don't know," the officer replied. "But he specifically requested a meeting. You don't have to agree to it if you don't want to." David's first instinct was to refuse. The last thing he wanted was another confrontation with Gerald, especially when he was feeling vulnerable and ashamed about his behavior. But curiosity won out over caution, and he agreed to the meeting. The conference room where they brought him was small and sterile, with just a table and a few chairs. Gerald was already seated when David arrived, still wearing his security uniform but looking much calmer than he had during their earlier encounter. The dirt had been cleaned off, and aside from a few small scratches on his hands, he seemed uninjured. "Sit down," Gerald said. Gesturing to the chair across from him, David sat warily, waiting for accusations or demands for additional punishment. Instead, Gerald surprised him by asking, "How's your daughter?" The question was so unexpected that David didn't immediately know how to respond. She's okay, I think. My wife finally got word and picked her up. She's at home now." Gerald nodded. "Good. That's good." They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Gerald spoke again. "I've got grandchildren," he said. 3 of them. 2 boys and a girl. David wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but he nodded politely. "The youngest one. She's about your daughter's age," Gerald continued. "And I've seen my son lose it with her a few times. Not like you did today, but I've seen him get so frustrated he didn't know what to do with himself." David felt a flicker of surprise. This wasn't the conversation he had expected to have with the man he had assaulted. "Being a parent is hard," Gerald said, looking directly at David for the first time since he had entered the room. "Harder than most people realize before they have kids. And sometimes good people do stupid things when they're pushed too far. I'm sorry," David said suddenly, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm so sorry about what I did. I've never done anything like that before in my life. Everything was going wrong, and you were treating me like I was some kind of criminal, and I snapped. But that doesn't excuse it. I could have hurt you seriously." Gerald was quiet for a long moment, studying David's face. "You know what I saw today?" he finally asked. David shook his head. "I saw a father who was having the worst day of his life. Dealing with a screaming kid and broken equipment, trying to solve his problems, and running into bureaucratic nonsense that made everything worse," Gerald said. "I saw someone who had reached his breaking point." David stared at Gerald in amazement. This wasn't the response he had expected from someone who had been assaulted with a stroller. "Now, don't get me wrong," Gerald continued, his tone becoming more serious. "What you did was assault, and it was dangerous, and it scared people. I'm not trying to excuse it or pretend it didn't happen. Then why are you here?" David asked. Gerald leaned back in his chair. "Because I've been thinking about it all afternoon. And I realized that my reaction to your problem probably made everything worse than it needed to be." David felt his eyebrows rise in surprise. "I saw a guy with a broken stroller and a screaming kid, and instead of trying to help him solve his problem, I focused on enforcing policy," Gerald explained. "I could have bent the rules a little, let you leave the stroller by customer service while you bought a replacement. Would have taken 5 minutes, solved your problem. Prevented the whole thing. You're not responsible for what I did," David said. "I made the choice to throw that stroller." "No, you're right about that," Gerald agreed. "You made that choice, and it was wrong. But I made choices too, and some of them weren't very helpful." Gerald pulled a folder from beside his chair and placed it on the table. I've been talking to mall management and to the police and to my supervisor, and I've made a decision. David looked at the folder nervously. Wondering what new complications were about to be added to his situation, I'm not going to press charges, Gerald said. David felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. What? I'm not pressing charges, Gerald repeated. I'm going to tell the district attorney that it was a misunderstanding that got out of hand, and that I don't want to pursue criminal prosecution. I don't understand, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I assaulted you, in front of dozens of witnesses. It's probably on video. Yes, it is on video, Gerald confirmed. And yes, you did assault me. But assault charges require the victim to want to press charges, and I don't. David felt tears forming in his eyes as the implications of Gerald's decision began to sink in. No criminal charges meant no jail time, no criminal record, no devastating impact on his job or his family. Why? David asked. Why would you do this for me? Gerald was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his answer carefully. A few reasons, he said finally. First, because I think you're a good father who had a really bad moment, not a dangerous person who needs to be locked up. Second, because your daughter needs her daddy at home, not in jail. And third, ... double quotes, looking slightly embarrassed. Third, David prompted, third, because about 20 years ago, I threw a wrench at my boss during an argument at work, Gerald admitted. Missed him completely, but scared the hell out of both of us. He could have fired me, could have pressed charges, could have ruined my life. Instead, he gave me a second chance and helped me figure out how to handle my anger better. David stared at Gerald in amazement. This man, who had seemed like an inflexible bureaucrat during their confrontation, was revealing himself to be someone who understood exactly what David was going through. The difference was that my boss recognized that good people sometimes do bad things when they're overwhelmed. Gerald continued. He saw that I wasn't a bad person who needed punishment. I was a struggling person who needed help. Gerald slid the folder across the table to David. Mall management has agreed to drop the trespassing charges as well. As long as you agree to some conditions. David opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were documents outlining a program for anger management, counseling, and community service, along with a formal apology letter to be delivered to mall management and staff. You'll need to complete 40 hours of community service and attend anger management classes for 6 months, Gerald explained. And you'll be banned from this particular mall for a year. But no criminal charges, no jail time, no permanent record. David couldn't speak. The generosity and understanding that Gerald was showing him felt overwhelming after the day he had experienced. There's one more thing, Gerald said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He pulled out a business card and handed it to David. This is the guy who helped me 20 years ago. He runs anger management and parenting stress programs now. I called him this afternoon and told him about what happened. He's expecting to hear from you. David took the card, his hands still shaking. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Gerald replied, standing up. Just make sure you get the help you need and make sure this never happens again. Your daughter deserves better than seeing her father lose control like that. As Gerald prepared to leave, David stood up as well. Gerald, he called out. The security guard turned back. Thank you, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself today. Gerald nodded. Just pay it forward someday, he said. Help someone else who's having the worst day of their life. The journey forward, 3 days after the incident at the mall. David sat in Dr. Patricia Williams' office, holding the business card that Gerald had given him and feeling like he was starting his life over from scratch. The anger management counselor's office was warm and comfortable, filled with soft lighting and plants that created an atmosphere completely different from the sterile environment. Where he had been processed after his arrest, Dr. Williams was a woman, in her 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put David at ease. She had listened to his account of the mall incident without judgment, asking occasional questions but mostly letting him tell the story in his own words. What strikes me most about your story, Dr. Williams said after David finished, is not the moment when you lost control, but everything that led up to that moment. David looked at her questioningly. You describe months of accumulated stress, sleep deprivation, financial pressure, and the constant challenge of trying to be a perfect parent, she explained. The stroller incident was just the final pressure that caused an explosion that had been building for a long time. But that doesn't excuse what I did, David said quickly. I could have seriously hurt Gerald. I traumatized my daughter. I created a dangerous situation for everyone around me. You're absolutely right, Dr. Williams agreed. It doesn't excuse what you did, but understanding what led to that moment is crucial if we want to prevent it from happening again. Over the following weeks, David began to understand that his explosive moment at the mall had been the culmination of patterns he had been developing. For months, without realizing it, he had been trying to be the perfect father, the perfect husband, the perfect employee, all while ignoring the signs that he was becoming overwhelmed and burned out. Parenting is one of the most stressful jobs in the world, Dr. Williams explained during one of their sessions. And unlike other stressful jobs, you can't clock out at the end of the day. You can't call in sick. You can't quit when things get too difficult. That constant pressure affects people in ways they don't always recognize. David began keeping a journal, tracking his stress levels and identifying triggers that made him feel overwhelmed or angry. What he discovered surprised him. The mall incident hadn't been caused by one moment of extreme frustration. It had been the result of dozens of smaller moments where he had swallowed his anger, pushed down his stress, and convinced himself that he was handling everything well. I thought being a good father meant never getting frustrated or angry. David told Dr. Williams, I thought I had to be calm and patient all the time, no matter what was happening. And when you inevitably felt frustrated or angry, what did you do with those feelings? She asked. David thought about it. I ignored them. I told myself they were wrong. The good fathers don't feel that way. So those feelings had nowhere to go, Dr. Williams observed. They just built up inside you until something relatively minor triggered an explosion. The insight was both painful and liberating. David began to realize that his anger at the mall hadn't come from nowhere. It had been accumulating for months. Like pressure in a boiler with no release valve. At home, Sarah had been incredibly supportive, though David could see the concern in her eyes when she looked at him. The night after the mall incident, they had stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about what had happened and what it meant for their family. I was so scared. Sarah had admitted, not scared of you, but scared for you. I've seen you getting more and more stressed, but I didn't know how to help. Why didn't you say anything? David had asked. I tried a few times, Sarah replied. But you always said you were fine, that you could handle everything. I didn't want to add to your stress by pushing the issue. That conversation had led to others. And gradually, David began to understand how his attempt to be the perfect father had actually made him less available to his family. By trying to handle everything on his own, he had isolated himself and missed opportunities for support that could have prevented his breakdown. Emma had been surprisingly resilient. At 2 years old, she didn't fully understand what had happened at the mall, but she had definitely sensed the tension and upheaval that followed. David had been worried that she would be afraid of him, but instead she seemed to cling to him more, as if she sensed that he needed extra comfort. Children are remarkably forgiving, Dr. Williams had told him. What matters most to Emma is not that you had a bad moment, but that you're working to make sure it doesn't happen again. David's community service assignment had been both humbling and educational. He was working at a local food bank, helping to sort donations and prepare packages for families in need. The work was physically demanding, but emotionally rewarding, and it gave him perspective on his own problems. Many of the families he served at the food bank were dealing with stresses that made his broken stroller incident seem trivial by comparison. Single mothers working multiple jobs, elderly people choosing between medication and groceries, families who had lost their homes due to medical bills or job losses. It's funny, David told Dr. Williams during one of their sessions. Working with people who have real problems has made me realize how much I was focusing on things that weren't really that important. Like what? She asked. Like having the perfect stroller, or never being late to anything, or always having Emma dress perfectly when we went out. David replied, I was so worried about looking like I had everything under control that I lost sight of what actually mattered, one of the most valuable parts of his community. Service was working with other parents who were also dealing with stress and overwhelm. The food bank had a support group for parents, and David had started attending their weekly meetings. The first time I told my story to the group, I was terrified they would judge me, David told Dr. Williams. But instead, almost everyone had a story about a moment when they had lost control or done something they regretted. The support group had shown David that his experience wasn't unique. Parental burnout was common, and many good parents struggled with feelings of anger, frustration, and inadequacy that they didn't feel safe expressing elsewhere. One woman told me about the time she locked herself in the bathroom and screamed into a towel because her baby wouldn't stop crying, David shared. Another dad talked about the day he punched a hole in his garage wall after his teenager got arrested. These are good people who love their children, but they all reached breaking points. Dr. Williams nodded. That's why support systems are so important. When parents try to handle everything alone, they're much more likely to reach those breaking points. As the weeks passed, David began developing new strategies for managing stress and anger. He learned breathing techniques for moments when he felt his temper rising. He established regular check-ins with Sarah where they could honestly discuss how they were both feeling. He started exercising regularly again, something he had abandoned when Emma was born. Most importantly, he learned to recognize the early warning signs that he was becoming overwhelmed, and to ask for help before reaching his breaking point. The old David would have seen asking for help as a sign of weakness, he told Dr. Williams. The new David sees it as taking responsibility for my family's well-being. 6 weeks after the mall incident, David encountered Gerald again, this time at the grocery store, where they both happened to be shopping. David's first instinct was embarrassment and shame, but Gerald greeted him warmly and asked how he was doing. I'm working with a counselor, David told him, and doing community service, learning a lot about myself. Gerald smiled. That's good to hear. How's your daughter? She's great, David replied. We bought a new stroller, and she loves it. No more broken equipment disasters. They talked for a few minutes about parenting and stress management, and Gerald shared some of his own experiences from when his children were young. You know what I learned from my anger management work? Gerald said as they prepared to part ways. The goal isn't to never feel angry or frustrated. The goal is to learn how to handle those feelings in ways that don't hurt other people. As David walked away from that encounter, reflected on how much his understanding of strength and control had changed. Before the mall incident, he had thought that being strong meant never showing weakness or asking for help. Now he understood that real strength came from recognizing his limitations and taking proactive steps to address them. The community service and counseling were requirements from his agreement with the mall, but David had begun to see them as opportunities rather than punishments. They were giving him tools and perspectives that were making him a better father, husband, and person. The full circle 1 year later, David stood in the parking lot of a different shopping mall, watching a scene that looked disturbingly familiar. A young father was struggling with a broken stroller while his toddler cried inconsolably. The man's face showed the same mixture of frustration, embarrassment, desperation that David remembered from his own worst day. David's first instinct was to keep walking. He had completed his community service months ago, finished his anger management program, and rebuilt his life after the incident that had nearly destroyed everything he cared about. He wasn't looking for reminders of his lowest moment, but as he watched the struggling father, David remembered Gerald's words from their conversation in the police station. Just pay it forward someday. Help someone else who's having the worst day of their life. David approached the man carefully, not wanting to startle or intrude. Excuse me, he said gently. Looks like you're having some stroller trouble. Can I help? The man looked up with the wary expression of someone who had been receiving unwanted advice all morning. It's fine, he said automatically, though clearly nothing was fine. Just a mechanical problem. David knelt down to examine the stroller while the man's son continued crying. The issue was obvious. A safety pin had worked loose from one of the wheel assemblies, causing the front wheel to wobble dangerously. I think I see the problem, David said, pulling a small toolkit from his keychain. This happens more often than you'd think. Mind if I take a look? The relief in the father's eyes was immediate. "Please," he said. "I've been fighting with this thing for 20 minutes." As David worked on the stroller, he introduced himself and learned that the struggling father was named Michael. His son Tyler was 18 months old. Today was supposed to be a fun father-son outing, while Michael's wife attended a baby shower. "Everything that could go wrong has gone wrong," Michael said, bouncing Tyler in an attempt to calm him down. "First the car wouldn't start, then we got lost, then the parking garage was full, and now this. I feel like the universe is conspiring against me." David smiled, remembering similar thoughts from his own disastrous mall experience. "Those days happen," he said, securing the wheel mechanism. "Trust me, I know." Within 5 minutes, David had the stroller working properly again. Tyler had calmed down as soon as his familiar seat was available. Michael looked like an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I can't thank you enough," Michael said. "You've probably saved my entire day." "Don't mention it," David replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "Can I give you some advice that someone gave me when I was struggling with parenting stress?" Michael nodded eagerly. "It's okay to have bad days," David said. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed and frustrated. What matters is recognizing when you're reaching your limit and asking for help before you do. Something you'll regret." Michael's expression suggested that David's words had hit home. "Sometimes I feel like I'm failing at this whole father thing," he admitted. "Every good father feels that way." "Sometimes," David assured him, "the fathers who are actually failing are the ones who don't care enough to worry about." They talked for a few more minutes, and David found himself sharing some of the stress management techniques he had learned in counseling. Michael listened intently, clearly hungry for any guidance from someone who understood the challenges of parenting young children as they prepared to part ways. David pulled out his wallet and removed a business card, Dr. Patricia Williams' card, which he had been carrying for months as a reminder of the help that was available when he needed it. "If you ever find yourself getting really overwhelmed," David said, handing Michael the card, "this woman is amazing. She helped me through some really difficult times." Michael took the card gratefully. "Thank you," he said. "Really, thank you for everything." David watched Michael push Tyler into the mall, both of them looking much happier than they had 15 minutes earlier. The interaction had taken less than 10 minutes. But David felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with fixing a mechanical problem. That evening, David told Sarah about his encounter with Michael while they put Emma to bed. At 3 years old, Emma had grown into a talkative, energetic child who showed no lasting effects from the traumatic day at the mall. If anything, she seemed to have inherited David's increased awareness of other people's emotions and needs. "I'm proud of you," Sarah said as they sat on their couch afterward. "Not just for helping that guy today, but for everything you've done this past year." David reflected on how much had changed since his explosive moment 12 months earlier. The anger management program had taught him practical skills for managing stress and frustration. The community service had given him perspective on his problems and connected him with people who were facing much greater challenges. The counseling had helped him understand the patterns of thought and behavior that had led to his breakdown. But perhaps most importantly, the experience had taught him that strength came from vulnerability, not from trying to appear invulnerable. By admitting that he needed help and accepting that help when it was offered, he had become a better father, husband, and person. "You know what's funny?" David said to Sarah. "That day at the mall was the worst day of my life. But in some ways it was also one of the most important days. It forced me to face things about myself that I had been avoiding for years." "Do you ever regret what happened?" Sarah asked. David considered the question carefully. "I regret hurting Gerald, and I regret scaring Emma, and I regret creating that whole dangerous situation. But I don't regret the journey it sent me on, because that journey made me into someone better." 3 months later, David received an unexpected phone call. It was Gerald, who had gotten David's number from Dr. Williams with David's permission. "I wanted to let you know about something," Gerald said. "Remember that conversation we had about paying it forward?" "Of course," David replied. "Well, I had my own opportunity last week. Young mother at the mall, dealing with twin babies and a stroller that wouldn't cooperate. She was getting really frustrated. I could see her heading toward a breaking point. Gerald went on to describe how he had approached the woman, helped her with the stroller problem, and connected her with parenting resources when he realized she was dealing with postpartum depression and had no support system. She reminded me of you that day, Gerald said. Good person. Overwhelming situation. Just needed someone to show a little kindness instead of enforcing rules. That's amazing, David said. How is she doing now? Much better. She's getting counseling and has connected with a support group for mothers of multiples. But here's the thing. She asked me how she could pay it forward. And I told her the same thing I told you. David smiled, understanding the chain reaction that Gerald was describing. The kindness and understanding that Gerald had shown him was rippling outward, creating opportunities for other people to receive help and then offer help in return. 6 months after that phone call, David got another surprise. Dr. Williams contacted him to ask if he would be interested in sharing his story. As part of a parenting support group she was starting, she wanted parents who had experienced breaking points to talk with, other parents who were struggling with similar challenges. Your story is powerful because it shows that good people can do bad things when they're overwhelmed, but also that people can recover from their worst moments and become better than they were before, she explained. David agreed to participate and found that sharing his experience with other struggling parents was therapeutic for him while being helpful for them. He learned that his story resonated with many people who had never acted on their anger but had certainly felt the same overwhelming frustration that had driven him to throw that stroller. The goal isn't to prevent people from ever feeling angry or overwhelmed, David would tell the support groups. The goal is to help them recognize those feelings early and respond to them in healthy ways. 2 years after the mall incident, David encountered Michael again, the father he had helped with the broken stroller. Michael was now volunteering at the same food bank where David had done his community service, and he told David that their brief conversation had been a turning point in his approach to parenting. You showed me that struggling didn't make me a bad father, Michael said, and you connected me with Dr. Williams, who helped me develop better coping strategies. Now, I'm trying to do the same thing for other parents. As David listened to Michael describe his volunteer work and the parents he had helped, he realized that Gerald's vision of paying it forward had created something bigger than any of them had imagined. A chain of kindness and understanding that started with one security guard's decision to show compassion, instead of seeking punishment, had grown into a network of people helping other people through their worst moments. That night, as David tucked Emma into bed, she asked him a question that caught him off guard. Daddy, why do you help sad people? David thought about how to explain something so complex to a 4-year-old. Because someone helped me when I was sad, he said finally. And when someone helps you, you want to help other people too. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. Like sharing toys? Exactly like sharing toys, David agreed. But instead of sharing toys, we're sharing kindness. As David turned off Emma's light and closed her door, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with his worst moment and led to some of his best. The broken stroller that had triggered his explosion had taught him that mechanical problems were just mechanical problems, easily fixed. With the right tools and a little patience, the real problems were the emotional and psychological pressures that built up when people tried to handle everything alone. But those problems were also fixable, with the right tools and the right support. And like Michael helping other struggling parents, and Gerald showing compassion instead of seeking revenge, and Dr. Williams dedicating her career to helping people through difficult times, the solution often involved people who had found healing choosing to help others find the same healing. David's moment of explosive anger had lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but the lessons, growth, and connections that grew from that moment had been reshaping his life for years. It had taught him that the worst moments could become turning points, that asking for help was a sign of strength rather than weakness, and that the best way to heal from making a mistake was to help others avoid making the same mistake. Most importantly, it had taught him that being a good father didn't mean being perfect. It meant being willing to grow, to learn, to admit mistakes, and to do better. And sometimes, that growth began with the courage to accept help from unexpected sources, even from the people you had hurt the most.